I am going to talk about two things today. In our first story, I'm going to dive deep into the antitrust cases against Visa and Google, exploring how laws from a century and a half ago have become the biggest tools governments have to control big tech. In our second story, I look at the dark side of globalization and how the path of many countries to prosperity is emerging as their greatest threat. Welcome to the third episode of our newest show, The World Simplified. I'm Tarun, and every week on the show, I simplify some of the biggest developments in finance and economics that are reshaping our world. Let's start with antitrust. You probably use Google services more than once in every waking hour of your life. If you're looking up something, you probably Google it. To communicate, there's Gmail. For entertainment, you watch a YouTube video. If you're trying to get somewhere, Google Maps is your best friend. In fact, you're watching this video on a Google service at this very moment. Meanwhile, if you're big on using cards for payment, chances are that Visa is your biggest link to all of the commercial world. You probably depend on these businesses for your life to run smoothly. So, what happens if these companies try to take advantage of your dependence? This is the big question the American legal system is facing right now. In the last couple of years, the US Justice Department has hit Google with two major antitrust lawsuits, one of which they've already lost. These cases might fundamentally alter how Google operates. Meanwhile, Visa has recently been sued as well for keeping others out of the debit card business. Today, we get to the heart of all of it, why these lawsuits are happening and why you should care. Our world is run by mega businesses. We outsource large parts of our life to companies that are bigger in scale than entire countries. Here are just a few examples. Every time someone swipes a card, there's a 60% chance that Visa is processing the transaction behind the scenes. Of every 10 rupees spent on digital advertisements in the whole world, 7 go to either Google or Meta. One third of the world's cloud market, the backbone of the internet, is owned by Amazon, and so on. There is perhaps no other era in history where such few entities control so many aspects of our life, from how we communicate, to how we pay, to even how we work. While these entities have made our lives easier, they've also made us vulnerable. From important documents to your deepest secrets, these companies know everything about you. They can and often do set conditions that you have to follow. Think about it. If you have a strong dislike for Google's privacy policy, for instance, what can you do? Can you fight them? Or do you have to fall in line? There is thankfully an area of law that can be the people's champion, the antitrust law. Now, what is antitrust and why does it exist? Antitrust laws ensure that businesses compete fairly. They're driven by one big idea: competition disciplines businesses. If a business's customers can get up and move to a competitor overnight, that business has to stay on its toes and keep them happy. The problem today is that a lot of big businesses don't have worthwhile competition. If you don't like YouTube's membership model, for instance, there's no other place you can choose to watch millions of videos on every topic under the sun. If you don't like how Instagram is designed to hijack your attention, there's no other place you can keep up with your social circle. You're basically trapped. This gives today's mega businesses a lot of power. Antitrust laws are meant to prevent these imbalances. When a business has too much power, antitrust laws kick in and stop them from doing anything that hurts their customers or pushes out other rival businesses. This is why you have a very real stake in these cases. While they are happening in America all the way across the world, they might level the playing field between Google and you. Antitrust laws first came about in a time that was quite like ours, where the big businesses of the day held considerable control over people's lives. It was the late 19th century. The US economy was growing rapidly. With railroads expanding to connect the width of America, the country was unified as a cohesive economy for the first time in history. American businesses scaled like never before during this Gilded Age. While this Gilded Age was a time of incredible growth, it was also one of incredible consolidation. Between 1895 and 1904, for instance, over 4,000 companies merged into just 257 huge conglomerates. Those who owned these companies had immense power over the American economy and politics. Take John D. Rockefeller, for instance. His oil refining company, Standard Oil, was notorious for its aggressive tactics, exploiting workers, buying out competition, and lobbying for political influence. By the 1880s, after 20 years of operation, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the US oil refining market. The rise of monopolies like Standard Oil set off alarm bells in the public. Oil workers faced terrible work conditions, small businesses were struggling to survive, and consumers had fewer and fewer choices. Something had to change. In 1890, the US Congress passed the world's first modern antitrust law. The Sherman Act was intended to break up monopolies and prevent companies from teaming up to eliminate competition. In 1911, this law was enforced against Standard Oil. The US Supreme Court found that the company had used monopolistic practices to maintain its dominance in the oil industry and ordered that it be broken up. The giant was unwound into 34 independent companies. Many of these, such as ExxonMobil and Chevron, became major oil companies in their own right. For much of the 20th century, it was believed that a good market was one with plenty of companies so that none of them would dominate. This was the legacy of the Harvard Structuralist School. The structuralists believed that big companies would inevitably use their size to block new competitors, limit innovation, and control prices, even if they weren't immediately raising prices for consumers. These ideas heavily influenced antitrust law. However, in the late 1970s, a new way of thinking emerged from the University of Chicago. This Chicago school argued that big companies weren't necessarily bad for competition. It claimed that large firms could even be more effective than their smaller competitors, providing better services at lower cost. This is why, instead of focusing on the number of companies in the market, the school argued that antitrust laws should exclusively look at consumer welfare. Consumers didn't care for the number of choices they had as much as they cared for the prices being low. As a result, they argued the government should only intervene if a company's actions directly harmed consumers by raising prices. This became the dominant view in the 1980s, leading to a more selective enforcement of antitrust laws. When today's big tech companies began their upward journey, this obsession with prices saved them from antitrust scrutiny. Companies like Google and Facebook offered services that were technically free. And because they weren't making consumers pay for anything, no matter what big tech companies did, they couldn't possibly harm consumers. But behind the scenes, these companies were becoming giants, gaining the power to shape entire industries, which they often used freely. Their rise went largely unchecked because regulators weren't looking beyond price to see the broader impact on digital markets. As a result, we find ourselves in another gilded age, where a handful of massive companies wield enormous influence over the markets. On one hand, we benefit enormously from the services they provide. But on the other hand, their immense power raises concerns. It's hard to even imagine a tech industry that wasn't cornered by a few companies. This is why today's antitrust battles are so important. While big tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Meta have undeniably created enormous value and convenience in our lives, the counterfactual remains unseen. We simply have no idea how digital markets would have developed if they were more competitive from the start. For over a decade, the digital economy has developed without the constant disciplining pressure of competition. Without rivals pushing them to innovate responsibly and protect consumer interests, these companies set the rules for the entire market, influencing how technology evolves. Imagine a world where those rivals did exist. While big tech has led to groundbreaking innovation with more competition, we might have seen more diverse approaches to new technology and faster advancements. In a competitive landscape, different platforms may have taken different approaches in dealing with misinformation or rage-inducing content, allowing for a less polarized environment than today. If competition was stronger, some companies might have innovated around privacy-first business models, giving users genuine alternatives that protected their personal information, and so on. Ultimately, one can only understand the true potential of these industries when many different businesses are free to explore their own destinies. Right now, single companies control the trajectory of entire sectors, limiting the diversity and potential benefits that come from open competition. Greater antitrust scrutiny is vital to unlock this possibility. We have explored the potential benefits of antitrust enforcement. However, currently there are big challenges in suing digital companies for antitrust enforcement. Ultimately, antitrust laws were built for an era of steel mills and railroads, not for digital empires built on data and free services. For an antitrust case to work in court, one must have to prove that a company has caused harm. However, it is difficult to show harm when its services are free. Ultimately, as long as digital companies give consumers something and take nothing, it's hard to point out how they harm consumers, no matter what their practices may be. This is complicated by an additional dynamic. Unlike traditional businesses which charge money, Digital businesses collect user data as their currency. Unfortunately, people treat their data very differently from how they treat their money. As a result, our existing ways of thinking about consumer harm simply don't apply. Big tech companies operate globally, beyond the reach of any single national regulator. Antitrust laws differ across countries, making coordinated enforcement challenging. Antitrust laws differ across countries, making coordinated enforcement quite challenging. Big tech companies are seen as strategic assets in global competition, especially against rivals like China. Now let's move on to talk about the two cases that Google is facing, its search and advertising case. Let's start by breaking down these two cases. The search case centers around Google's dominance in the search market, where it controls an astounding 90% of global search traffic. How does Google maintain such an overwhelming lead? Part of it comes from the billions of dollars Google spends each year, reportedly around 20 billion annually, to ensure that it is the default search engine on popular devices like Apple's iPhones. The US Department of Justice, or DOJ for short, argues that these deals effectively block out competition. Competitors like Bing or DuckDuckGo simply can't get the same visibility when Google is paying to be the default option everywhere. What's Google's defense? The company argues that users prefer Google because it offers the best search experience. However, a judge recently ruled that these practices were anti-competitive, declaring Google a monopolist in the search market. This ruling has brought up several potential remedies, each of which could drastically change how the search market operates. First one, banning exclusive agreements. One option is to stop Google from making exclusive deals with companies like Apple. Imagine setting up your next device and being given a choice of search engines, Google, Bing, or DuckDuckGo. The second one, splitting Google's search business. Another possibility is breaking up Google's search business from its other products, like its advertising business or Android. This would stop Google from tying its search engine to other services. And the third one, data sharing. Finally, Google might be required to share anonymized search data with competitors. This would give other search engines access to similar data and make it easier for them to offer relevant search results, promoting fair competition. Each of these remedies could profoundly alter the search market, giving smaller competitors a chance to compete. However, it's important to know that Google will likely appeal, and these legal battles could take years to fully resolve. The second major case against Google focuses on its dominance in digital advertising. And this is where things get even more complex. Google controls multiple layers of the ad tech ecosystem. Google owns platforms like Google AdSense, which publishers use to sell advertising space. It also owns Google Ads, the tools that advertisers use to buy that space. And to top it off, Google controls Google AdX, the exchange where these ads are bought and sold. This gives Google an enormous amount of power, essentially making it the gatekeeper of digital advertising. To put this into perspective, imagine a stock market where one company owns the stock exchange, acts as the broker for both the buyers and the seller, and even controls some of the stocks being traded. That's what Google has created in the world of digital advertising. The DOJ claims that Google uses this dominance to block out competitors and force both advertisers and publishers to use its services, which in turn drives up its advertising prices and reduces transparency. This creates a market where small businesses and competitors can barely compete, as Google controls nearly every aspect of the advertising process. To address this issue, the DOJ is proposing breaking up Google's ad tech business. By separating the different parts of the ad ecosystem, such as the platforms where ads are bought and sold and the exchange where the transactions take place, it could ensure that one company doesn't hold all the power. But just like the search case, these legal battles will take time. Google is likely to appeal, and we are looking at years of appeal. In both the search and advertising case, the consequences could be enormous, not just for Google, but for the entire tech ecosystems. If these antitrust remedies go through, they could reshape how we experience the internet and how businesses interact with digital markets. Now, Google isn't the only giant facing regulatory scrutiny. Let's shift our focus to Visa, a financial heavyweight whose dominance in the payments industry is at the center of its own antitrust battle. Visa is more than just a name on the card you swipe. It's a giant in the financial system, acting as a gatekeeper for most global transactions. With a network that processes trillions of dollars annually, Visa dominates the credit and debit card markets. But Visa's business model is different from that of a traditional bank. Visa isn't issuing credit or holding deposits. Instead, it operates as a payment network. When you use your debit or credit card, Visa is responsible for processing the transaction and takes a small fee for every swipe. These interchange fees, paid by merchants to the banks and then split with Visa, are a major source of the company's revenue. So, in nearly every card transaction, Visa takes a cut. At the core of the DOJ's lawsuit is the claim that Visa is leveraging its market dominance to stifle competition, particularly in the debit card market. The DOJ alleges that Visa has created barriers to competition by controlling a significant share of US debit card transactions. In doing so, Visa has allegedly restricted smaller networks and fintech startups from effectively scaling, locking them out of a market where Visa sets the rules. Visa's exclusivity agreements are one of the tools it allegedly uses to maintain its dominance on the market. By forcing merchants and payment processors to route transactions exclusively through its network, Visa limits the ability of competing networks to grow. These punitive measures make it harder for smaller, PIN-based networks or new payment platforms to expand. The DOJ claims that Visa's practices effectively block competition, which could lead to higher fees for small businesses and ultimately higher costs for consumers. Visa has also been accused of actively working to maintain its monopoly by making it difficult for newer, lower-cost payment systems to get a foothold. So what might happen next? If Visa is found to be abusing its market power, we could see some significant changes. The DOJ may push for Visa to change how it does business. The hope is that it will lead to more competition in the payments industry, leading to lower fees for consumers and merchants alike. Much like the Google cases, the outcome here could reshape the industry, changing how we think about and interact with financial transactions in the future. But there's a long legal road ahead. It's not only the US that's grappling with the dominance of companies like Google, Amazon, and Visa. Regulators across the globe are facing the same challenge, though each region brings its own philosophy and methods to the table. In particular, the European Union has been highly active in taking action against these tech giants. The EU's approach to competition law centers on ensuring fair access and stopping gatekeepers, like Google and Apple, from abusing their dominant positions. This is why we've seen big fines levied against these companies in Europe and why the EU passed the DMA, short for Digital Markets Act. This legislation specifically targets companies that have disproportionate power, making sure they can't unfairly favor their own services at the expense of competition. For instance, Google can no longer promote its own shopping services over others in search results. In contrast, the US has traditionally taken a more hands-off approach to regulating big tech. For many years, American regulators focused on consumer welfare, particularly on keeping prices low. Since companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon offer many services for free, it was hard to justify antitrust cases under that framework. After all, how can consumers be harmed if they aren't paying for the service? But as concerns over privacy, misinformation, and the sheer market dominance of these companies have grown, the US has started to ramp up its antitrust efforts. Now, with these lawsuits and investigations, the government is attempting to rebalance the scales of competition. So, why should all of this matter to you? At the end of the day, it's about choice and fairness. These powerful companies impact nearly every part of your life, from what you see online to the fees you unknowingly pay to the way innovation is shaped by their dominance. The choices you have, the services you use, and the costs you incur are all influenced by how these giants operate. We are at an important moment in history regarding how we regulate some of the most powerful companies the world has ever seen. The decisions made in these antitrust cases could reshape not only the tech industry, but also the way we interact with technology itself. Now, I'll move on to the second story and talk about the dark side of globalization. Imagine a world where entire economies can be crippled, not by bombs or armies, but by the control of a single strategic resource or location. Picture the flow of oil, semiconductors, or even global finance being turned on or off like a tap. This isn't a movie plot, but the fragile truth of our interconnected world. Today, I want to talk about something that quietly shapes global markets, trade, and even our daily lives. Choke points play a crucial role in global trade, and any disruptions in choke points have immediate consequences. Today, we're going to explore how vital resources move through choke points and how nations are increasingly using them as weapons of economic warfare. Your first thought might be, why should I care about these choke points? Well, our global economy relies on keeping these choke points open. Think about this for instance. Every single day, about one-fifth of the world's seaborne oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, imagine if there was a war in that narrow waterway, which is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Oil prices would skyrocket globally, and all of us would feel the pain at petrol pumps. The Taiwan Strait is another critical choke point, an important route for global trade and home to Taiwan, a key semiconductor hub. If this choke point were blocked or attacked, it wouldn't just delay the latest iPhone you have ordered. Everything from washing machines to life saving medical equipment would just become useless pieces of metal and plastic on factory floors. And those are just two of the hundreds of choke points in the global economy. But why does all of this matter? We live in a world full of delicate connections, and these choke points are the weak links in that chain. They can be blocked, disrupted, or even weaponized. That's not just a theoretical threat, it's happening more and more as the world fragments and tensions between countries rise. Let me give you a little historical context. In the early 20th century, a British journalist named Norman Angell made a grand prediction. He argued that war between major nations had become pointless due to economic interdependence. His logic was simple. If countries are economically linked, going to war would only destroy their economies along with their enemies. Who would willingly set fire to their own house? In a world where trade and industry were becoming more globalized by the day, Angel's idea made sense. Why would any rational nation destroy the very system that keeps it prosperous? Was he right? Well, just a few years later, World War I broke out, involving deeply interconnected nations like Britain, France, and Germany. The devastation proved Angel's theory wrong. Wars began not despite economic ties, but sometimes because of them. So, what went wrong? The problem was that while economic ties can lead to peaceful coexistence, they can also create vulnerabilities. Being too dependent on another country for resource or trade can become a serious risk. If those connections break, it can create severe problems for dependent nations, as World War I tragically demonstrated. Fast forward to today, and this idea of interdependence has mutated into a dangerous form. Welcome to the age of weaponized interdependence. What does that mean? In simple terms, it's when countries use the economic dependence of others as a weapon. Two political scientists, Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman, came up with this idea to show that in today's hyper-connected world, military power isn't the only weapon nations can use. Instead, countries can weaponize the very systems that underpin the global economy, trade, technology, and finance to gain leverage over their enemies. When that happens, it can lead to complete chaos, as we shall soon see. So, what are the world's most important choke points and why should you care? Let me start with natural choke points. These are narrow geographic passages that connect major waterways. With over 90% of global trade moving through oceans, any disruption here could have massive consequences. Take the Strait of Hormuz. Picture an oil tanker departing from the Persian Gulf, a region that's home to the largest oil producers in the world, such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and the UAE. To deliver its cargo, the tanker has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow stretch of water, only 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. This passage links the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. The strait is one of the most strategically important waterways on the entire planet. Why? Every day, around 21 million barrels of oil, which is about 20% of the world's total oil supply, flow through the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not just oil. 20% of the world's natural gas also moves through here. If this narrow waterway were blocked because of war, global oil prices would surge, sending shockwaves across the world. The prices of everything from fuel, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers to food and consumer goods would shoot up. This isn't hypothetical. Current tensions between Iran and Israel are increasing, putting the strait at risk. Another important choke point is the Strait of Malacca. It's a narrow sea passage that runs between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. The strait connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, and over 40% of global trade flows through it. For China, Japan, and South Korea, which are the world's largest economies, 64% of their maritime trade passes through Malacca. If the Malacca Strait were blocked, these economic powerhouses would be crippled almost immediately. Factories would run out of fuel, industries would come to a halt, and the ripple effects would touch every corner of the global economy. You'd see shortages, price spikes, and widespread panic, all because one narrow stretch of water was disrupted. Finally, there's another choke point that often makes the headlines: the Suez Canal. It's located in Egypt and it's a vital shortcut between Europe and Asia. This route helps save ships the long and expensive journey around Africa's southern tip. Around 12% of global trade passes through the canal, along with 7 to 10% of the world's oil supply and 8% of global natural gas. To put that in perspective, one third of all global shipping container traffic goes through this narrow waterway. In 2021, we saw just how fragile this choke point could be when the Ever Given, a massive container ship, got stuck, blocking the canal for nearly a week. The incident caused an estimated loss of $9 billion per day, while more than 400 ships at the peak of the crisis were stuck waiting to pass through the canal. Fast forward to November 2023, and the Suez Canal faced yet another challenge. This time, the problem was linked to the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, have been targeting vessels in the Red Sea near the Bab al Mandab Strait, a crucial maritime route for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. As a result, many major shipping companies started redirecting their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. This alternative route added 30% more travel distance with an extra 3,500 nautical miles. Traffic through the Red Sea plummeted, with container ship traffic dropping 50 to 60% compared to previous years. But not all choke points are physical. Some are production choke points. These are the specific places where the world's critical goods are produced. Take Taiwan, for example. It's a small island, but it's super critical to the global economy. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors and around 77% of the global market for integrated circuit fabrication. One company in particular, TSMC, short for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, produces nearly 90% of the world's most advanced chips. These tiny chips are the brains behind everything from smartphones to electric cars. Without them, much of modern technology simply stops working. Imagine if China's chip production were disrupted, either by natural disaster or escalating tensions with China. If Taiwan's semiconductor industry is affected, it wouldn't just mean a delay in getting your next phone, it would force entire industries to stop their operations. Car manufacturers would struggle to meet demand, tech companies would face delays, and prices for anything with a chip inside would just soar. We've already had a taste of this scenario during the COVID-19 pandemic. Taiwanese chip makers were hit by factory shutdowns and supply chain disruptions, and it triggered severe shortages across the globe. The automotive sector was one of the hardest hit sectors. Companies like General Motors and Volkswagen were forced to pause production and lost hundreds of billions of dollars because of the delays in getting chips. This was just a glimpse of how critical Taiwan's semiconductor industry is to the world. The United States, specifically North Carolina, is an important location because of another critical mineral, and that is ultra pure quartz. This isn't just a rock, it's a key component in semiconductor manufacturing. Without ultra pure quartz, producing advanced semiconductors would be impossible. Given how dependent our world is on technology, any disruption in quartz supply would cripple industries worldwide. We saw this play out in 2024 when Hurricane Helene hit North Carolina, affecting mining operations. Immediately, there were concerns over quartz supplies within the semiconductor industry. Now imagine if there is a conflict between the US and China and US decided to stop exporting quartz to China. Such a scenario would create chaos in the global semiconductor market and by extension, the global economy. Now let me talk about China because this country is like a mega choke point for a lot of things. One of the most important choke points is related to the supply of rare earth elements. These minerals are crucial for everything from smartphones to military hardware, and China controls about 80% of the world's supply. Rare earths are hard to substitute, and back in 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan, China briefly stopped exports of these critical minerals, leading to chaos in Japan. It was a terrible example of just how disruptive these choke points can be when they are weaponized. And it doesn't stop there. China also dominates the market for lithium ion batteries, and it controls more than 70% of global production capacity. As the world increasingly shifts towards electric vehicles and renewable energy, these batteries have become the backbone of green technology. A disruption in China's supply chains would have far reaching consequences, not only for the EV market, but also for the green transition. Now, let's shift our focus to something even more fundamental: food. In 2022, the world got a horrible reminder of just how fragile the global food systems are when Russia invaded Ukraine. Together, these two countries account for nearly 30% of the world's wheat exports. When war disrupted their ability to export, Global wheat prices soared by over 70% and hurt some of the poorest countries and developing economies. The impact wasn't just on food. The war also affected the global fertilizers market. Russia and Belarus together accounted for 40% of the world's potash trade before the war. Potash is a potassium rich mineral and is vital for plant growth. It's primarily used as a fertilizer to improve agricultural production. After the invasion, global fertilizers prices spiked due to disruptions and sanctions targeting Russia and Belarus. The reduced supply of fertilizers led to fears of widespread impacts on agricultural production, especially in developing countries that relied heavily on these imports. The countries hardest hit by these disruptions were poorer nations in Africa and the Middle East that relied heavily on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. For these regions, it wasn't just a matter of rising food prices. It became a question of survival as global food insecurity worsened. Now, let me talk about something that's less tangible but equally powerful: financial choke points. And at the heart of this is the US dollar, a weapon that doesn't involve missiles, armies, or military bases, but banks. The US dollar became the backbone of the global financial system due to a combination of historical events and strategic decisions. After World War II, the world was looking for a new international financial system to support post war recovery. At the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, the dollar was chosen as the global reserve currency backed by gold. This system linked all the other global currencies to the dollar, providing financial stability. However, everything changed in 1971 when President Richard Nixon took the US off the gold standard, effectively decoupling the dollar from gold. From that point on, the dollar wasn't backed by anything tangible. Its value was linked to the strength and stability of the US economy. Despite this, the dollar's dominance continued to grow. At the height of the Cold War, the US wasn't just the world's military leader, it was also the financial leader. And as it became clear that control over global finance could be a powerful tool, the US began to weaponize the dollar. Economic sanctions became a key instrument of US foreign policy, used to pressure its adversaries without the need for military intervention. But before that, let me explain economic sanctions, which has become the preferred weapon of the United States. Economic sanctions are penalties imposed by countries on another nation or specific individuals aiming to deter or weaken enemies. There are various ways sanctions can be imposed, like trade restrictions, financial sanctions like freezing assets, or blocking access to the global banking system, travel bans, technological restrictions, etc. The underlying goal is to fight without firing bullets. The US has a long history of using sanctions to exert its influence. In fact, one of the longest running sanctions in modern history targets Cuba. After Fidel Castro rose to power in the 1960s and nationalized US owned companies, the US imposed a trade embargo that effectively isolated Cuba from American goods and capital. The idea was to weaken Castro's regime by economically isolating it. That embargo is still in effect today, over 60 years later. But Cuba was only the beginning. During the Cold War, the US ramped up the use of sanctions to pressure the Soviet Union and its allies. Countries that aligned too closely with communism or threatened US interests were targeted by economic penalties. These sanctions weren't just about punishing nations, they were about cutting off adversaries' ability to finance their military activities or support unfriendly regimes, all without firing a single shot. Then the terrorist attack of 9/11 marked a turning point in how the US viewed its financial power. The government realized that terrorists weren't just using guns or bombs, but also money. Networks like Al Qaeda relied on complex financial systems to move funds across borders, often using shell companies and secret accounts to avoid detection. This is where the US saw a new opportunity, that is, to use its control over global finance to combat terrorism. The US expanded its powers to track financial transactions, freeze assets, and investigate suspected terrorist financing. Central to this effort was the SWIFT network. For those unfamiliar, SWIFT is not a bank itself, but a secure messaging system that allows banks around the world to transfer money across borders. It's an essential part of how modern banking works. Being cut off from SWIFT is like pulling the plug on a country's access to the global financial system. Fun fact, when I worked in the banking industry, I used SWIFT to transfer funds for foreign bill purchases, but it was not until I researched this topic that I realized what it actually was. After 9/11, the US began using SWIFT to track the flow of money related to terrorism. But there was a catch. While SWIFT is a European organization, a copy of its data was stored on servers in the US. This gave US authorities access to an unprecedented amount of financial information, allowing them to monitor transactions all over the world. This development wasn't without controversy. European nations, in particular, argued that the US was overreaching, violating privacy, and exerting too much control over the international financial system. But despite the diplomatic pushback, the US had found a powerful new way to weaponize its dominance over global finance. Sanctions and SWIFT didn't just target terrorist networks. Soon, they were used to target entire nations. Take Iran, for example. In the early 2000s, the US imposed severe sanctions on Iran by targeting its access to SWIFT in an effort to stop its nuclear program. The effects on Iran were devastating. Oil exports plummeted, inflation soared, and unemployment spiked. The US had successfully choked off one of the world's largest oil producers from the global financial system with just a few strokes of a pen. The most dramatic use of sanctions came in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The US and its allies froze $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves. Russia was also effectively locked out of the international banking system, making it almost impossible for the country to stabilize its currency or fund its war efforts. It was a stunning display of the power of the dollar. Imagine spending decades building up financial reserves as a buffer against economic shocks, only to lose access to all of it in a matter of days. Despite the effectiveness of these sanctions, countries are growing wary of US dominance in global finance. China and Russia are leading efforts to build alternatives to the US centric system, developing their own SWIFT like networks and urging others to follow suit. While these systems are still in their early stages, they are a sign of growing desire to break free from the US financial control. So, where does all of this leave us? The US remains the gatekeeper of the global financial system. Through the dollar, the US has an insane amount of power to influence global politics without firing a single shot. But as more countries are targeted by the US, they are increasingly looking for ways to operate outside of the US's reach. And this is where the future of global finance may be heading, towards a more fragmented system where financial power is no longer concentrated in one nation's hand. To truly understand weaponized interdependence, it's good to look at a little bit of history. Let's begin with World War One. At the time, Britain was the dominant naval power, but it didn't just use its navy for military operations. Britain turned its naval supremacy into an economic weapon by enforcing a blockade against Germany. This blockade wasn't just about stopping military supplies. It was designed to choke off essential goods like food and raw materials, things civilians needed to survive. Germany's civilian population began to suffer immensely. By the end of the war, over 4 lakh German civilians had died from malnutrition and related diseases. The blockade crippled Germany's economy and pushed it closer to defeat. But it's not just sanctions that tell the story of weaponized interdependence. Trade wars play a role too. Take Australia in 2020. After calling for an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19, China was angry and it imposed tariffs on Australian wine, restricted coal imports, and slowed down shipments of key agricultural products. It was a clear message to Australia. If you do something we don't like, we can cause a lot of pain for you. These examples show wars aren't always fought with weapons. Sanctions, blockades, and trade restrictions are now powerful tools in the global economy, causing damage as devastating as bombs. Having spoken about all of this, let's now dive into the complex economic rivalry between the world's two largest economies, the US and the China. When we talk about economic warfare, this relationship comes to the forefront because the strategies they employ aren't just about competing, they could shape the future of global power. At the heart of modern economic warfare lies the growing tension between the US and China. As the world's leading economic powerhouses, their rivalry isn't just a game of trade tariffs or currency disputes. This tension could have much more serious consequences if it continues to escalate. Some experts even speculate that at its worst, this could lead to a direct confrontation between these two nuclear superpowers. But instead of relying solely on traditional military tactics, both countries have learned to weaponize their positions in global networks, though in fundamentally different ways. For the US, economic warfare has traditionally revolved around its dominance of the global financial system. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and that gives America an immense amount of leverage. Since World War II, the US has been using sanctions as a primary tool of coercion, imposing financial penalties on countries that step out of line with its policies. This power only grew after 9/11 when the US further integrated the SWIFT system, the backbone of global financial messaging, into its financial warfare strategy, as we spoke about earlier. On the other hand, China takes a different approach to economic warfare, relying more on its role in global supply chains and its massive domestic market. China doesn't use sanctions as frequently as the US. Instead, it uses its market access to punish countries or companies that cross it. For instance, like I mentioned earlier, when Australia called for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, China retaliated economically, imposing tariffs on Australian goods. A more recent example of this strategy is China's export restriction on gallium and germanium, materials that are essential for advanced semiconductor production. In 2022, China produced 98% of global gallium and 60% of germanium, and its control over these critical inputs poses a major threat to the global tech industry, especially as tensions over technology and semiconductors between the US and China continue to escalate. But it's not just resources and market access that these two giants use in their economic battles. The US also has a history of bending international organizations to its will. Take the WTO, short for World Trade Organization, as an example. Under the Trump administration, the US threatened to cripple WTO by blocking the appointment of judges. China, meanwhile, has been accused of using its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, as a tool of economic coercion. The BRI involves massive infrastructure projects in developing countries, but critics argue that many of these projects lead to debt traps, situations where countries borrow money from China, but they can't repay, and they are forced to give up control of strategic assets. For instance, when Sri Lanka couldn't pay back loans for the construction of the Hambantota port, they had to lease the port to a Chinese company for 99 years. Similarly, countries like Djibouti, Kyrgyzstan, and Montenegro are facing unsustainable debt levels tied to Chinese infrastructure projects, raising fears that they too might lose control of key resources or territory. In the end, both the US and China are engaged in a high stakes game of economic warfare, but they play it in ways that reflect their unique strengths. The US dominates financial networks and wields its influence over international organizations, while China uses its market power to coerce other nations. As these two superpowers continue to weaponize their economic relationships, countries around the world are caught in the middle, trying to navigate a web of economic interdependencies that could change at any moment. This ongoing economic conflict between the US and China isn't just about trade policies or financial systems, it's about power. And as both nations continue to flex their economic muscles, the rest of the world is left grappling with the consequences of this new kind of warfare. Let's now step back and take a look at how all of these shifts in global power are shaping a more fragmented world, one that's increasingly split into competing blocks. And the consequences of this fragmentation could be far more dangerous than we realize. The world today is rapidly fragmenting into different blocks, much like the divisions during the Cold War, but with some differences. After World War II, the world was split into two main camps: the Western Bloc, led by the US, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. By the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seemed as though the Cold War era had truly ended. The US emerged as the undisputed global superpower, and many in the West believed that liberal democracy and free markets had won. There was a sense that this new world order, which was based on these values, was here to stay. But history doesn't move in straight lines. By the 2020s, the global landscape had begun to shift again, with new powers emerging and old rivals resurfacing. Historians now argue that today's world isn't simply returning to the bipolar structure of the Cold War. Instead, it's becoming multipolar, with many powers now trying to exert their influence on the global stage. Countries like China, Russia, and India, as well as emerging coalitions such as BRICS, are increasingly trying to carve out their own areas of influence, creating a world that's far more complex and fragmented than the Cold War divisions ever were. One of the more worrying aspects of this fragmentation is what some experts refer to as the rise of an axis of authoritarians. According to political scientist Aaron Friedberg, this bloc is led by China and Russia, whose ties have strengthened significantly, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Their partnership, often described as a no-limits alliance, is just one part of a broader trend where authoritarian states work together to counter Western influence. This alliance doesn't just stop with China and Russia. It extends to countries like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. As this authoritarian axis grows, the West, led by the US and its European allies, finds itself once again in a value-based confrontation. The invasion of Ukraine, China's increasingly aggressive posture in the Indo-Pacific, and Russia's expanding ties with Iran and North Korea all point to a growing challenge to the liberal order that has largely governed the world since World War II. At the same time, countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia are refusing to be drawn into a US China rivalry, choosing instead to remain independent. This is reminiscent of the non aligned movement of the 1950s. For example, hundreds of countries that make up half of the global economy refuse to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, showing that the world isn't easily divided into two camps anymore. These nations are increasingly leveraging their interdependence to negotiate better terms with both the US and China, ensuring they aren't caught in the middle of great power politics. But this fragmentation isn't just about shifting diplomatic alliances, it's also about economic blocks. China is redrawing global trade routes, creating supply chains that increasingly fall under Chinese influence. On the flip side, the US and its allies are also trying to build their own alternative supply chains to reduce their dependence on China. As a result, we are seeing a world where global trade, technology, and even finance are increasingly becoming fragmented. Political scientists like Hal Brands and historians like Niall Ferguson have raised concerns about where this fragmentation could lead. They warned that it could spark a series of interlocking global conflicts. We are already witnessing wars in Europe and the Middle East, and tensions in East Asia, especially over Taiwan, could easily escalate. If conflict were to break out simultaneously in these regions, we could be looking at a new type of global war, less coordinated than World War II, but just as devastating in its impact. In this fragmented world, controlling choke points becomes an even more critical weapon. Whether it's the Strait of Hormuz, the Taiwan Strait, or financial systems like SWIFT, nations will increasingly look to control these key nodes. As supply chains grow more regional and less global, countries will feel freer to weaponize their control over these choke points, knowing that the effects will hurt their rivals more than they hurt the global economy. But what does all of this mean for the world we live in? We've explored the complexities of choke point and weaponized interdependence, showing how crucial locations and resources can be transformed into weapons. As the world splits into distinct blocks, this growing fragmentation raises the likelihood of countries weaponizing their control over resources, trade routes, and financial systems. When global cooperation reduces, nations become more willing to use choke points. As we've discussed, conflicts in Europe, the Middle East, or East Asia may seem geographically isolated, but in reality, they are deeply intertwined through global networks of trade, technology, and energy. Each conflict would add pressure on the others, creating a domino effect that destabilizes not just individual countries, but entire regions, possibly sparking an uncoordinated global crisis. So, what's the key takeaway from all of this? The modern world is a delicate web of interdependence, and as the web fractures, the tools for economic coercion become sharper and more frequently used. Control over choke points, be they physical locations, industries, or financial systems, can be wielded as a weapon, making international relations even more precarious. We are now living in a time where global connections are both a source of strength and vulnerability. And that's it for today. I'll see you in the next one.